Welcome to the Bearded Bereans, where we analyze topics of the day in the light of the scriptures.
Well, welcome to the special episode of the Bearded Bereans. My name is Cole Strawn, and I'm joined by Jason Bolt. Today, we have a fun topic to discuss. We really are trying to make it through our first season. If you've been listening along, we do appreciate your time and would love to hear your feedback. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Jay, what are you smoking there?
I have another half of a Valkyrie.
Hey, you know what's funny? If we keep asking that question and smoking the same cigars, they're going to think that we don't have any other cigars or anything. Because I'm smoking the Immaculata again.
Yeah, that's the same thing you've had the last I don't know how many times.
But here's the deal, people that are listening, especially people that do not have any idea about stogies or any kind of tobacco. Cigars are expensive. And so if you want to enjoy them, you have to find the deals where they are. And yeah, that's just the way it works. So one of these days we'll have different cigars that we smoke. Of course, the first season, I mean, we smoked different cigars quite a bit. So maybe I'm just projecting.
We've had some. We're just in a not a rut, but
in a glorious
kind of like a rut. Yeah, a rut, but with positive connotations to it.
Yeah. So I don't know if we have we done an apology for, and by apology I mean defense, for enjoying cigars. We might need to do that at some point.
Well, we addressed it at some point. You asked me how I justify doing it on a podcast, something like that, and I said, well, if people don't like it, they don't have to watch.
That's true. But I think
that's not really an apology, though.
Yeah, I think it'd be really good to give a positive case for enjoying the good gifts God has given, and not being called to slavery, but freedom. And so,
yeah, maybe a better topic, broader topic would be Christian liberty, and we could use this as the example, but Christian liberty in general.
Yeah, I think that'd be fun. But you were telling me about another topic. Do you have your headline handy? This is interesting.
Yeah, so I've mentioned on a couple of occasions that I get all my news from the Babylon Bee. And Seth Dillon was in town earlier this week at a fundraiser for my school, and that was quite enjoyable. So he got up and read a few headlines, recent headlines, and everyone in the crowd was laughing like it was the first time they had heard them. And I kind of looked around. I said to my wife, like, don't they read the Babylon Bee 5 times a day like I do? How is it that they haven't heard these before?
Because other people have a life, Jay. That's what it is.
Well, maybe. They at least have different priorities, I guess, than I do. But anyways, maybe it was yesterday, I was checking the news on Babylon Bee, and I came across an article that referenced something like the 10 crazy Christian nationalists from history who thought that human rights were given by God and not by the government. And they go through and list off John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and all these people, as these crazy extremists. So then I had to find out, well, what's the actual story? What are they satirizing here? What is the thing that they're exaggerating? And I looked around a little bit, and I found the clip actually from it's off of MSNBC, and I honestly don't know who this lady is. It's probably because I get all my news from the Babylon Bee and not from legacy networks. Heidi Prisbilla, I don't know how to say her last name, but it's a brief little clip. It's about 3 minutes, and she's talking about Christian nationalists. And she doesn't really define them, but she describes them as these extremists, and there's all these different groups of Christian nationalists. And then she goes on to say, but there's one thing that unites all of them together. And here's what she says. This is the quote. The thing that unites them as Christian nationalists, not as Christians, because Christian nationalists are a very different thing, is that they believe that our rights as Americans and as all human beings do not come from an earthly authority. They don't come from Congress or from the Supreme Court. They come from God.
Wow.
So she's talking about the dangers of Christian nationalism, and the thing that brings them together is this crazy idea that our rights as human beings don't come from the government, but instead come from God. And apparently that's crazy and extreme, and we probably shouldn't allow people to think that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, that would be dangerous. But just backing up a little bit, I mean, Christian nationalism has an interesting history, I guess you would call it. I mean, it's been modern history for sure, more recent, but recently it's really hit the airwaves. And do we even say that anymore? The radio wave, the airwaves. It's really hit the media,
cyber waves,
the cyber waves.
the 5G waves,
The things that are giving us cancer waves. If certain people
the
are to
China
be believed,
waves.
the China waves, yeah, the microwaves. So there's been an interesting phenomena that has developed. You have this movement in liberal media to really castigate Christians by calling them Christian nationalists, and they really had created this boogie bear about Christian nationalists. And I remember seeing it back in 2016, 2017, around that time, and thinking, you know, what are they getting at? Like, I don't understand where this is coming from. And it kind of developed, and Doug Wilson and Canon Press really kind of got involved in that. And uh, really the main point that Doug made was, hey, Christian, they're going to call you Christian nationalist. So you could either appropriate that and just run with it and make it your own, or you could, you know, try to push it off, and it's funny because it's like he saw this article coming, maybe, um, 3 years ago, whenever they released that book. And I think the Christian Nationalist book has only been out for maybe a year. But thinking through the quote, and trying to put myself in a non-Christian nationalist shoes, as a Christian sees that quote, what are you thinking as a Christian? Like, so she's saying that Christian nationalism is defined by someone who thinks God is the one who gives us rights. Okay. Well, I believe that. I must be a Christian nationalist. And one thing that I would love to see happen after this type of nonsense going on is maybe people rethink their engagement with politics, right? Maybe people would rethink how they're winning the lost with winsomeness and all that, and not bringing to bear the law of God as well. At what point do you not see that we're on the same side? We all need to be in the same boat, rowing in the same direction, and oppose this crazy nonsense where, um, what was her name? Rigmarole?
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What? We have morons running our country, literal morons, who can't see that what she says. We have Christians thinking that rights come from God. Well, everything comes from God, but besides that, like, your God gives you rights, right? Because her alternative is the government. And so it's a battle of ultimates. And you're either in group A, who believes in the government giving you, and I'm saying their group A because, I mean, let's face it, they're the majority of the talking heads right now. So Group A, either the government gives you rights, or Group B, God gives you rights. It's not Christian versus Christian nationalists. It's Christian versus pagan.
Yeah.
That's the reality. And she just
Yeah.
pointed it out in black and white. And there's no getting around. There's no escaping that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think big picture, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we can talk about in what you just said, but big picture, rights are granted from whatever the ultimate power is, right? Whatever
Mm-hmm.
the absolute entity is. And we've talked about, philosophically, how everybody ultimately appeals to an absolute personal being, in some way, whether they admit it or not. But even if you want to reject the existence of God, you're still going to appeal to some kind of ultimate, even if it's not a personal being, but you're going to appeal to the government. And that's precisely what she's doing, is she's juxtapositioning. Is that a word? She's putting next
Juxtaposing.
to each, juxtaposing.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking in my head, and I thought that didn't have enough syllables. I got to add more syllables to it so I can sound smarter, but then I just sound dumber.
Well.
So she's pitting against each other and comparing the government is ultimate or God is ultimate. And
Mm-hmm.
what she's saying is, if you think that God is ultimate, then you're a crazy extremist, and you probably want to overthrow the government, or take people's rights away, or I don't know what. Or you recognize that, oh, see, the government is actually the all benevolent, all powerful, good entity that's here to protect you and make sure and keep you safe and all those great and wonderful things. But the point is, we all appeal to an ultimate authority. The question is, which one are you going to appeal to?
Mm-hmm.
And is that entity actually ultimate or not? And I mean, it's crazy. You just look at our founding documents, and they contradict what she says. So I don't know how you can appeal to the government as an ultimate authority when its defining documents clearly state that it's not the ultimate authority.
Right. Right. And just kind of pushing that a little bit further with the individuals in Babylon B did this wonderfully with their article, but we have theists and Christians and all sorts of stripes coming together in our founding, and they all thought that rights came from God. They were endowed by a creator with certain inalienable rights, right? So it's hilarious to me because I don't know this. I have not read anything from her before, but she's probably the same type of person that would say that America is not a Christian nation. I'm just
Yes.
taking a shot in the dark here.
Yeah,
Well,
that's a safe assumption. Yeah.
well, at the same time, saying that America is a Christian nation. It's like
Yeah.
the cognitive dissonance in this one quote is astounding. I don't know. It's actually shorting out my brain as we talk right now.
Yeah, I wonder with people like her, if they know that what they're saying is just absolute nonsense and that's their aim, is just to put a bunch of nonsense out there, or if she's actually that challenged rationally and logically that she doesn't see the contradiction.
Well, I think what probably happened is she did a little bit of research on what Christian nationalism is. And she read that and she thought, well, I know some Christians, scare quotes, right, that don't believe that. They're with me. They think that rights come from God. And why does she think that about Christians? Either A, she is one of these, non-believing Christians, for lack of a better category, or B, she knows that functionally churches all around America, and I hate harping on this. We've talked about this a couple times on the podcast, but churches all around America practically said the same thing whenever they shut down due to the pandemic orders.
It's true.
So, of course, she thinks there's this distinction between Christian and Christian nationalists, when the reality is, to be a Christian, one of your one of your foundational confessions is that Jesus Christ is Lord, right? One of your foundational confessions is that God is the giver of life. And he's the giver of all good gifts, which includes rights, because we're made in his image, and he has a certain conception of how we ought to live, and what we ought to be free to do. And it just shocks me that there are Christians out there that just don't see it. And it's the same. It's the same as the neutral space Christians, right? Who think there's neutrality still, and they live in that neutral bubble, and they're trying to constantly win the enemies of Christ over with soft words, and um, it's really the same phenomena, I think.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to do two things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, First, I'd like to actually talk about rights, what they are, and how we know that those are human rights, and how that then got embedded into our founding documents. Um, and then I'd also like to just spend a little bit of time on the Christian nationalist thing, and bring it into today a little bit, and just talk a little bit about that uh, movement, that terminology. I don't really know what to call it, but maybe we could bring some definition to it for some of our listeners who maybe didn't read Stephen Wolfe's book. Let's talk a little bit about rights and where they actually do come from. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I'll just say this to start off with. So we analyze everything in the light of the scriptures. So obviously, if God has granted rights to mankind, we would find them in the scriptures, right? That's the one option that we have. We can't just kind of make up our own stuff. That's another thing that she said. She goes on in the quote talking about how the problem with this, that rights are granted from God, is that these crazy extremists are the ones deciding what God is saying, and they could just decide, oh, you can't murder babies anymore, or whatever it might be. And well, it's true, you shouldn't be murdering babies. We don't just get to decide what God says. He's actually written it down in a book for us. It's objective. It's there for her to read, for me to read, for you to read. It's our responsibility to read what he's given us and then apply it to society. But no, we don't just get to make stuff up.
Right.
So she's way off on that one.
Right.
So where then do we find these rights? There's, in my mind, there's three of them, three basic fundamental human rights. Where do we find that?
Where do we find life? Are you going life, liberty, property?
Yep.
Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, obviously that's John Locke, right?
Yeah.
So John Locke's philosophy, mankind has three basic fundamental rights: the right to his life, the right to his freedom, and the right to his property. But he didn't just make that up, right?
Yeah.
It's not like he was sitting around and out in his backyard one day smoking a pipe and like, oh, I think these sound like good rights. That came from somewhere. He was just simply writing it down. But I mean, that had been common for thousands of years by the time that he wrote it. So where does he come up with this?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I don't know where Locke pulled from, but I do know that if I were answering this to someone off the street, I would say, I would build the case from creation. God giving us his image, breathing life into us. He created us. He made us alive. And then he, by way of negation, puts a penalty for taking that life. You know, I think is it Genesis 9 or is it Genesis 6? It might be Genesis 6:9 actually, where Noah is getting off the ark. Is it Noah? Yeah, I think it is Noah.
Well, if he's getting off the ark, there's not a whole lot of people who walked off the ark, so your options are pretty slim.
This. Yeah, right. I'm trying to. No, he didn't say this after Cain. It was Noah. Where he said if man dies by man's hands, or the blood of man is shed, then that blood will be required of him. And so you have this very clear, this life is worth something, and I will punish you by my sword through the government that's instituted, right? Um, I'm going to punish you by for taking that other life unjustly. That's a pretty significant right, I would say, to be able to live.
Yeah, I would think so. Um, I mean, it's really recorded throughout all of Scripture. You know, it starts in the very beginning, being created in God's image, and we shouldn't destroy the things that God creates in His image. And but it gets really codified for us, of course, in the Decalogue,
Mm,
right? The Decalogue, Ten Commandments. It's the Israelites coming out of Egypt. They're in the wilderness, and God brings them His moral law, and these things have been revealed here and there up until that point in Exodus 20, but he codifies it for us. And there's a number of things that are said in there, but don't murder your neighbor. Okay, so that's the command. It's a negative command. It says don't do this thing, but of course, along with the negative commands, there's also a corollary positive command, which would be to protect human life. So not only do I can't murder my neighbor, but if my neighbor is in danger, I need to help him. Right? That's the
right.
Good Samaritan. The whole parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus, works that out for us in that parable. And so there's this underlying principle that every human being has the right to his own life,
Mm,
and no other human being has the right to just take it. Of course, the government has the power to wield
wield
the
the sword.
sword.
Hmm.
Um, and in cases where God has specifically delegated that authority to the government. But I can't just up and decide, yeah, you know what, I'm going to kill this person,
Right.
because everyone has the right to their life.
Yeah.
Um, we see the same. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, two things. Have I been saying codify wrong this entire time up until this point in my life? Or is codify and codify tomato, tomato?
I'm going to go with that. The second one, tomato, tomato, because if it's not tomato, tomato, then I'm the one saying it incorrectly.
Well, yeah. I don't know. I've never heard it said codify, but I knew what you meant. I just hadn't heard that
So
before.
I prefer to say codify because it's more clear what it actually means. Right?
Encoding. Yeah.
It means to put it into a code. Like this is the
Yeah.
written code.
I like that.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Codify. It's like, what does that mean? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously, I know what it means, but so
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong.
No, no, I like that. And there's I think there's importance in clarity, especially moving forward. We're in the most uneducated point in history, I think, as far as what the public school is producing. I used to work in admissions for a Christian school, and the students that I worked with, far and away, were just terrible with whether it's vocabulary or being able to write an essay or you know you, you name it. So I think clarity moving forward is good. Maybe we could build back better. Oh, sorry, that was an oblique reference to a terrible political agenda. So yes, the Decalogue, clearly, thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not murder. And so, because there's a commandment against it, that establishes a right. Is that what your point is? Just for clarity,
Uh, I don't know. It doesn't establish the right.
the
the
right's
The
already there.
commandment, yeah, the commandment is a result of the right.
Hmm.
The reason you can't kill your neighbor is because he has the right to his life.
And that's given by virtue of
Yes.
the image
What
of
you
God.
said,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah,
what you said is created in the image of God. And if anyone is going to take that life, it's going to be God, uh, not you.
yeah. He's the only one with the authority to destroy his own image.
Right. Yep. So let's jump over to property then. Thou shalt not steal.
Hmm.
Why? Because your neighbor has the right to his own property. It's his. It's not yours, so you can't take it. Um, this is exactly where Locke was coming from. Again, the command comes from the right or exists because the right is inherent. It's the way that God has built human society. In exercising dominion over the earth, we take ownership of something by exercising dominion over it. So, originally, as the first families started to spread across the earth, they would exercise dominion over a particular plot of land. That land would produce stuff. Then they would make stuff with the stuff that land produced. They would trade those things with other people who were working the land that they had, and they owned it by the fact that they were exercising dominion over it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they can trade and buy and sell their goods and that sort of thing. But property ownership is inherent in human society. It's just the way that God has made it. It's embedded in the DNA of creation, and the command to not steal from your neighbor simply recognizes that.
Yeah, and I think that is the key argument against socialism, right? Against communism. There is no there is nothing giving the government the right to take from one person what is theirs rightfully and give it to someone else. It doesn't matter what the justification is. It doesn't pass the thou shalt not steal. It's not just you individuals shall not steal, but governments should not steal. Corporations should not steal. It's something that you extrapolate out to the furthest possible place. The only person that can give and take at will is God, because it's all His. And so that's a key discussion, and that would actually be a great topic for another podcast. Is socialism and its interaction with the Decalogue. So,
yeah, I hope someone's writing these down so that we come back to them later and cover these topics.
Writing it down now.
Okay, that's good. Write it legibly.
Man, it's
We've
not
had that problem before.
We have.
If you write it legibly, then you can just take a picture of it, send it to me, and I'll read it.
Okay. I'll do my best.
Okay.
You realize I can't see the tip of the pen, so I don't know what's being written as it's being written. It's just muscle memory from 10 years ago.
All right, so that's property. That's pretty straightforward. Freedom. Freedom, we have to take a couple of steps to get there. We could certainly point to the anti-man stealing laws in the Old Testament. It's pretty clear that man stealing is a violation of God's moral law. It is one of the laws for a violation of which could lead to the death penalty. So man stealing or kidnapping is, enslaving a person, essentially, taking away that person's freedom. But I think one more starting place for it, I think it's actually embedded in the right to life right. Because if your life is yours and it's not mine, then that implies that you can actually do what you want with your life, and I can't do what I want with your life, right? Somebody has to decide what this life is going to do, the places it's going to go, the activities it's going to engage in, those kinds of things. And it simply follows that the person who has that life is the one who decides what to do with it. So it's not explicitly spelled out for us in the Decalogue, but it is, I think, embedded in it.
It just seems to me that a Christian is much more aware of freedom as it is given by God prior to Christ than any other person.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And obviously that's through revelation, and we are able to see with clearer eyes because we've been forgiven our sin. And so maybe it's just a question of acknowledging what God has given. But it seems like there's a much more well thought out, what is freedom, why is freedom, how is freedom, from Christians, not from atheists.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you just look at the history of the thought of freedom, it all comes from Christian philosophers and theologians. They're all the ones who are working out what freedom actually is, how we have it, how to get it, how to maintain it. It all comes from Christians. And then this is just off the top of my head, but it could be because the non-Christian world is enslaved to sin. Like all of us are. We're born into sin, we're enslaved to sin, and we
Hmm.
don't realize that we're enslaved to sin because we don't know anything else, right? It's just what we are. And we go through life thinking that that's just normal and not realizing that we're living our lives as slaves. And then those who come to Christ and find freedom in Christ from sin, then they realize, you know what, I've been enslaved my entire life, and Christ is setting me free from this enslavement. Um, and only then can they sort of step outside of that paradigm and even start to talk about freedom in a free sort of way.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thought process, but just to cap that off, and then we can go back to what we were discussing. Or I guess this still works, but um, this freedom that we have in Christ, that we have been given, helps us look at these things. It's no wonder as the world becomes less Christian, or at least our country becomes less Christian, it also becomes less free. Right? There seems to be a strong correlation between how Christian we are versus uh, how free we are. So I think that's definitely food for thought for maybe a listener that may not be Christian to think about.
Well, it's certainly true, and it leads right into what we're talking about here with John Locke and his philosophy. Um, Basically, Thomas Jefferson took John Locke, and they used him um, in order to say, "Hey, our rights are being infringed upon by our government, and the
Hmm.
government doesn't have the right to do that. It has certain authority, and its authority is certainly not to abuse our rights or to take them away." And so it gets written in the Declaration of Independence with a slightly different flavor. Thomas Jefferson talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you can read all sorts of stuff about what he means by the pursuit of happiness. My take on it is that that's what he means by property. It's you have the right to pursue economic activity in the way that you choose to. You have the right to use your property in the way that you want. You have the right to exercise dominion in the way that you want. Um, and that is the pursuit of happiness. I mean, we talk about the American dream. That's what the American dream is: exercising dominion, um, the way that I want to better myself and my family and the people around me. Um, that's the American dream. That's the pursuit of happiness, and that's John Locke's property. But it gets into the Declaration of Independence, and it's fascinating. Apparently, Heidi's never read the Declaration of Independence because it's really, really clear. He says the king has the authority to do these things, not to do these things. And we have these rights that come to us directly from God. There's no like stopover place where they take a layover somewhere and the government has to like analyze them, be like, well, okay, we'll give some of these to these people and this one to that person. No, it goes from God to man, no intermediary.
Hmm.
And the function of the government is to protect those rights. That's why
Right.
it's here. and and then I mean, it's quite interesting. I'm guessing lots of people in the federal government today would just outright reject what is said in the Declaration of Independence, that God has given us these rights, that it's the function of government to protect those rights, and when the government fails to protect them, the people have the right, sometimes the obligation, to then throw off that government and set up a new government that will protect them, which is precisely what happened uh, with the Declaration of Independence.
And that is the difference between the French Revolution and the American, right? We have a um, an acknowledgement of rights and throwing off the yoke of a government that is keeping man from those rights versus someone that just thinks things ought to be done differently. And, you know,
Right.
and so that actually leads to my question from earlier is, well, how in the world did people like Heidi, how they seem to be the kind that would be okay with revolution? in certain places, right? Um, they're certainly okay with the revolution that's taken place in the last 15 years in America.
Yeah, she's
Uh,
certainly okay with overthrowing the traditional way of government that we have had for 250 years. She's certainly okay with getting rid of that.
right. And so I don't that doesn't square. If government is the one that gives you rights, if the government is the thing that is doing all these things, then there is no right to revolution. There is no right to overthrow. There none of that. There's no justification. And again, we're led into this weird intellectual quandary. I can't get around. Can you help me make sense of that?
No, I can't because it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Um, so essentially, what she's saying is that the government bestows rights upon people, and if you have rights, it's because the government has given them to you. But at the same time, she's saying it's a good thing that we have gotten rid of the government that used to think that rights came from God. Well, wait a minute. How'd you get rid of that government if all of your rights came from the government?
Yeah. Yeah. It's absurd. It's absurd on its face. And think about the logical outcome of that. If we think government gives rights, then Nazi Germany is well within their rights because they're the ones giving it to
Yep.
take those rights away from the Jews.
Yeah,
Um,
and then the critique that she lays against these Christian nationalists that, well, then they can just decide what rights are and what they aren't. Well, no, that's not true because the scriptures determine it. But in your view,
it's
the
exactly
government
that
can just
case.
decide whatever your rights are and change them and take them away and hand them out to some people and keep them from others.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Historically, it's happened in Germany. It's happened in Italy. It's happened everywhere.
Happens
Um,
everywhere.
happens everywhere. So that's just the nature of humans. Is
Yeah.
whenever we're sinfully broken, where the image of God is hanging on in us by a thread, we tend to enslave other people and
Yep.
lord over other people and tell other people what they can and can't do. And that is just not the way God intended. I hate using that terminology because I don't want to get that mixed up with the decrees of God, but it's certainly not in keeping with his revealed will on how
Right.
humans
Yeah.
should participate in life. We have discussed life, liberty, and property. You said there was a second thing that you wanted to do. Is it
Yeah.
time to jump
Christian
into that?
nationalism. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think we can jump into that real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in Heidi's mind, there are two categories of Christians. There's Christian nationalists, which are some extreme group who think that they should bring their Christian beliefs into their public life. And then there's what she would probably consider real Christians, which are the ones that just leave their religion off to the side and engage in public life without any reference whatsoever to their theological beliefs, which is rather unfortunate. But like you said early on, it's the result of so many of us thinking that there's this neutral ground where we can engage in public life and we don't have to bring religion into it, and we can just act as if God doesn't really exist and we're just kind of here doing our own thing. There's lots of problems with that. One of the problems is, of course, that the other side is not neutrally engaging in public life, right? They're clearly engaging in public life and pursuing policy with God in mind, or rather with God not in mind.
Well, they're pursuing it in line with their own personal convictions, and they're
Right. Yeah.
telling you, Christian, that you cannot pursue those things in relation to your personal convictions.
Right.
And so if you put those two side by side, one is subhuman and one is not, right? That what they're affording themselves the ability to act within their convictions. That's what humans do.
Yeah.
Subhumans don't get to act in accordance with their convictions. But
Right.
yeah, get fired up about that. Go ahead.
So there's this term Christian nationalism, that she's obviously using derogatorily as if it's a really bad thing. And
Hmm.
you should probably not want to be a Christian nationalist, and you probably shouldn't want to be associated with anyone who's a Christian nationalist. Um, but in reality, all she's talking about is a person who believes that God is the ultimate authority and that what he says in scripture should have some bearing on what we do in our public life. Uh, that's Christian nationalism.
In her view.
Yes, and in mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, in her view, and that's crazy talk in her mind.
Hmm.
And in my mind, a Christian nationalist, in very broad terms, is a person who believes that God is ultimate and that He has said some things that ought to govern how we live our lives.
Yeah. The
And
reason,
that's true in my private life, and it's true in the life of a society.
right. And the reason I'm saying in her view is because I'm wanting Christians to hear that that's the only two options.
Yeah.
There's no third option here. Right? In that they're either going to see you as someone who is a Christian nationalist or the other.
Yep.
To be a consistent Christian is to be, in their view, a Christian nationalist.
Christian nationalism is becoming a bit of a what did you say earlier? A boogie, not a boogeyman, a boogie.
I think I
What
said
term did you
boogeyman.
use? No, it was something weird I had never heard before, and I thought, what is that?
Boogie,
Boogie bear.
booger bear. Yeah, I don't know where. So I do know where I
That's a
heard that
southern
from.
thing, I guess. I don't know.
No, it's a Louisiana thing. I think. We
Oh,
had a guy. Really short story. He was a Jesse Duplantis guy. Have you ever heard of Jesse Duplantis?
I've heard the name, but I can't tell you anything else.
Okay, crazy
No.
health wealth preacher,
Okay,
very
yeah.
charismatic.
Yeah, yeah,
So they have all sorts of weird words that come with boogaroo or booger something. It's so weird. But he was working on our flooring one time, and I heard him listen to Jesse Duplantis, and that's where I heard that word. That's just a booger bear or something like that. I don't know, but yeah. Let's call it a boogeyman because that's what I meant. I don't even know if I'm using how he used booger bear right. So boogeyman.
Okay, so Christian nationalism is a bit of a boogeyman, or they're trying to make it out as a bit of a boogeyman, and they're trying to link it to things like kinism and maybe some other movements where I think there's some real legitimate debate about whether or not uh, these are things that should be taken seriously or not. Um, but that doesn't mean that all Christian nationalists are these, crazy kinists or whatever the group happens to be. Christian nationalists are simply just those folks who think that God is ultimate or who have accepted that God is ultimate. And the reality is that every Christian should be in support of the idea that every nation around the world should be a Christian nation, right? I mean, God commands us to worship Him. Christ has all authority. He has so loved the world that He's given His own life, that whoever believes in Him might be saved. The
He
world
commands.
is, yeah.
He commands
Right?
everyone everywhere to repent.
Yeah, He commands everyone everywhere to repent. And
Yeah.
if we were all obedient and did what God tells us to do, the entire world would be Christian.
Right.
And that would be a really good thing.
Hmm.
And if our nations were ruled by Christians and the subjects in all of our nations were Christians and we all lived in accordance with Scripture, that would be a really, really, really good thing. In fact, I can't think of anything that would be better in this life. In fact, we're describing something close, though not fully, but something close to what the eternal state will be like. Why would we not want that here?
Hmm.
Now, we could argue about, wow, it's not really feasible and, whatever. That's fine. You can think it's not feasible, but that should be still something that we ought to think would be good for all of mankind if every nation were Christian. But yet somehow, even in the Christian's mind, within the evangelical world, to even think, well, every nation should be Christian. Wow, no, really, I'm not sure every nation should be Christian. Well, of course they should. Everyone
Yeah.
should repent and come to Christ.
Right.
Like, that's
Right.
not a radical idea.
Yeah.
That's like basic 101 Christianity.
Yeah. I think the fear is wrapped up in history. Obviously, the word nationalist brings nationalism brings a little bit of baggage with it, a little bit. But also, I think there's certain things in Christian history. I mean, we tried sacralism. It didn't work well, right? I mean, where you have Christians being drowned because they have a different doctrine, and you know, we've had this uh, experiment, Christendom 1.0 or whatever, where it didn't seem to go as well as you would hope. But I think they got something wrong there. They actually made the church, if not the state itself, certainly ruling over the state, right? Where you have church matters that are state matters and vice versa, which is clearly confusing the roles that God has given them. And so we're not talking about that. We're not talking about a church running everything in society. What we're talking about is Christians who may or may not be unified on certain subsets of certain doctrines, coming together and ruling in accordance with the scriptures. And by in accordance with the scriptures, I mean in accordance with God's law that is perfectly just, right, and good.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make, that Christian nationalism doesn't say that the church should rule the nations,
Right.
right? Um, it says that the nations should rule the nations, and they
Mm-hmm.
should do it in a Christian way.
Yeah. And the church should exercise prophetic voice to the nation
Yeah,
whenever it's airing.
yeah,
But that's not to say that they should control the nation. Far from it. There
right.
actually
And
is true separation of church and state in the Christian nationalist
yeah,
framework. Yeah.
yeah, there is. We've talked about this before in the three institutions: the church, the family, and the state.
Mm-hmm.
And whether we're talking about the country we live in now or some hypothetical Christian nation, the government still has the same authority and the same responsibility, and that's to protect the three basic fundamental rights of all of its citizens.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
if it's a Christian nation, that's what it's going to do, or a Christian government, that's what it's going to do. And if it's a pagan government, that's still what it should do.
Right.
That obligation doesn't change at all.
Yeah. So why don't we unpack just a little bit in what is the baggage that comes with nationalism? Obviously, you've got the Nazis, but what is nationalism?
Well, I think the baggage that comes along with it is it's understood in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it does come, from the nationalist movements in the 30s and 40s, where there was an elevation of one nation of people over all of the other nations
Yeah.
in a superior sort of sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I want to promote my nation because we're superior to all of you, and we don't really care what happens to you. In fact, we could conquer you and subjugate you because you're not as good as we are.
Yeah.
And that's not at all the kind of thing that we're talking about. A real genuine Christian view of nationalism would be that I want to promote my family and my neighbors, because these are the people with whom I interact, the
Mm-hmm.
people with whom I buy and sell. And of course, with technology today and the way that we travel and communicate, my neighbors, that's expanded a
It's a
lot.
global scale. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really is.
Mm-hmm.
But we should want to promote ourselves and everyone around us in a way that makes our lives better. And the way that we do that, to bring in Adam Smith here, is, of course, by serving other people. I mean, to talk about in an economic sense,
Right.
the beautiful thing about the free market is that if you want to succeed and you want to make money, you have to serve someone else. You have to meet someone else's need. And so it's actually this beautiful thing that God has embedded in economics, that it takes these wicked, sinful people who only want to help themselves and forces them to actually serve others.
Hmm.
It's really quite beautiful. But my point here is that a Christian view of nationalism would promote my own family and the people around me in a way that brings everybody up along with us.
Right.
Right? It's not I'm going to subjugate you in order to better me. It's I'm going to better myself, and as I'm doing that, I inherently have to help the people around me.
And so I don't really care if someone wants to call themselves Christian nationalist. That's not the point. The point is, who do you believe your rights come from? And if you believe that your rights come from God, then because this is the opposing side in how they define Christian nationalism, you're going to be called Christian nationalist. So it's it's just it's something that we need to be okay with. I mean, why do we want to separate ourselves at that point? Let's just say, hey, you know what? We all acknowledge that God is the one that gives us rights. We're all acknowledging that we would like Christ's kingdom to expand. Let's just acknowledge that, and let's start rowing in the same direction. We're a little bit, actually, a lot of these discussions were happening a year or 2 years ago, but it is funny that it in maybe we could talk about this in the last couple of minutes. It does seem to be the boogeyman that's set up. You know, why do you not have abortion? Well, you don't have abortion because it's Christian nationalists, right? Their God says you don't have the right, so you can't, you can't kill your baby. Or it's setting up and driving a wedge in the people. And I think they're going to do this only more and more. I don't think it's going to abate anytime soon. So, how do you think an individual Christian should posture themselves in these times whenever they're having these discussions with people?
Well, read Eric Metaxas's, if I said that correctly, uh, biography on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Um, it's like 850,000 pages. It's really long, man. I don't know if you like reading Metaxas's stuff or not. He's unbelievably thorough. So
Hmm.
if you like really thorough stuff, yeah, read that. If you want something a little bit shorter, he's got a more recent book out called Letter to the American Churches, which is sort of a distilled version of lots of things from his biography of Bonhoeffer. But what happened in the 1930s in Germany is the Nazis came in and they did the same thing. They drove this wedge straight through the church. And either you think God is almighty or you think the state is almighty. And they were able to drive out people like Bonhoeffer, and keep a huge portion of the church essentially within the state. And so you had this then state run Lutheran church in Germany that completely apostatized and went along with everything that Hitler did.
Mm.
And you had these few holdouts like Bonhoeffer, who said no, God is the ultimate, not the state. And so, I hesitate to tell people to be like Bonhoeffer because we know how that turned out for him. But all he did was recognize that reality, essentially, that the state is not ultimate. And he attempted to live his life accordingly and to teach accordingly. And he ended up giving his life for it.
Hmm. Yeah, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die, I think
Yep.
is the quote. That's
Yep.
something to be thinking about as
Yep.
we move forward in these times.
But
Well,
that's exactly what's happening here in our society is there's
Yeah.
this wedge being driven, and Heidi, I keep pointing to my phone here because this is where I have the quote. Um, Heidi and those like her are attempting to drive this wedge straight through the church and actually divide the church in order to conquer not just the church, but the people in it, and to subjugate them to their worldview.
Yeah, and it seems to have been successful at a certain. I mean, how many churches are out there flying rainbow flags at the moment?
Yeah.
It's sad, but it's also within even the Baptist church and conservative churches that wedge seems to have made its way, and I think that's why I've been so laser like focused on either you are or you aren't Christian nationalist, and it's just you know it's just something that I would like to see healed. I would like us to drive that wedge out because I mean we're not the enemy. The other side of the body is not the enemy. The people that think differently than you aren't the enemy. Let's coalesce around the idea that Christ is Lord. Let's coalesce around this idea that God gives rights. Let's move forward in that direction. And so that's very true. And I think you have to have your head in the sand if you don't see that wedge being driven by these people, right? It's clear. It's if it's not COVID, it's some what's that Vice documentary that goes to different places, and they did a Christian nationalist report. I mean, this has been going on since before COVID, and we just haven't been great at being united in the face of that. I think it's time to do better.
Yeah, I think we so often we take our theological differences and we're going to argue over baptism or the continuation of the gifts or church polity or any number of things, and obviously we're not all going to agree on those things. So then it's like, oh well, I guess we're not together then, and we can be divided on this issue of whether or not the state is ultimate or not. Well, that's nuts. Like
Right.
we
That's a
we can
primary issue.
yeah, we can all agree that our rights come from God, right? Every Christian agrees with that. We can all agree that the function of government is to protect those rights. And if we can agree on those things, which is basic and fundamental, then we're in agreement on Christian nationalism, and we should seek to see God actually rule over the nations through the scriptures.
Yeah.
And each denomination can still argue about baptism. That's fine. Like there's room for those disagreements within a Christian nation.
Yeah, and you could still even argue about Christian nationalism and what different nuances you want to say about which side. That's fine. But again, it's that primary thing of how we're defining Christian nationalism, how Heidi's defining it. Yeah, let's all agree that she's right. You know, she's right. She doesn't know she's right. She, she thinks she's right in another way, but she's right. And yeah, let's do better at that for sure.
No, I'll just say that I like being associated with people like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. Um,
Yeah, yeah. In the same breath, even.
yeah, yep. It makes me feel good about
Yeah,
myself.
it's right. Oh, the Bible does say that the fool says in his heart there is no God, and there's no more clear evidence of that than Heidi's quote, because it is so foolish that she doesn't see what she's done there, and um, yeah, it's we live in fun times because we're seeing the scriptures come alive. We're seeing fools everywhere being exposed, and they don't even know that they're being exposed in their foolishness. So, um, yeah, with that, I think it's good to go. Please share, like, subscribe. Tonight was just a conversation, and we're going to continue recording our seasons and um, looking forward to interacting with you guys on all these things. So we will see you guys, I don't know, at some point. Until next time, God
All right,
bless.
thanks, Cole. We'll see you guys.
The kings who fight against my Lord shall taste his wrath and meet his sword.